Welcome to the Bible Forum. I want to talk to you tonight about socialism. The top U.S. economists have weighed in. U.S. Representative Ocasio-Cortez recently referred to the policy of modern monetary theory, the MMT, to explain how she would fund her proposals. She's a liberal socialist. Proposals that would cost tens of trillions of dollars. But a poll from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business of 42 top economists indicates that not one would support the basic tenets of her policy. One poll question asked how much they supported the statement, quote, countries that borrow in their own currency should not worry about government deficits because they can always create money to finance their debt. How did they answer? Not a single one of them agreed with that statement. Another asked, countries that borrow in their own currency can finance as much real government spending as they want by creating money. Again, not one economist agreed with that. The publication, Business Insider, gave a simplified definition of modern monetary theory. Put very simply, MMT posits that a country controlling its own currency can continue to pay down its debt as long as it is denominated in that currency. So Ms. Ocasio-Cortez assumes since the U.S. prints dollars and issues debt in dollars, it can pay down its debt in dollars, doesn't have to rely on taxes to fund the debt. But the theory says a country in the aforementioned situation is limited by the availability of real assets. Simply printing money doesn't solve a problem. It actually makes it worse since every new dollar is worth less. So while we can't just ignore the national debt, the United States record $22 trillion debt load doesn't matter until inflation and economic effects show up. Ocasio-Cortez's economic theory insists that modern monetary theory absolutely needs to be a larger part of our conversation. Did I mention she has a master's degree in economics from MIT? And she doesn't get it. A comment on this post said, when the resources are held by a small minority, they ultimately determine the fate of the majority. In case you missed the history books, all known forms of socialism in government have always been controlled by a minority making decisions for the majority. Belonging to that party doesn't make you a grand winner or part of the success. It just says, hey, we support the party. In fact, socialism actually concentrates the wealth into a smaller number of people, creates a system in which the gap between economies, at least in large-scale socialist societies like Russia and China, the economies of those select and chosen few people, while the majority of the populace live at economic levels far below that which we see in the capitalistic marketplace. Plus, within the socialist realm, those in that general populace will not, ever be able to change their situation. The winners are often picked young, and the rest are left to fend for themselves on a preset standard of living. That's something of what we saw this week in America, where these 50 or so wealthy people were scamming the education system to get their kids into better schools, knowing that if they got into those schools, it wouldn't matter about anything else. They would have a preset standard of living. Of course, we're watching a lot of this unfold in Argentina right now. Most of the population are slowly dying of starvation and lack of water. But there is a large segment of people who are living high. They continue to do just fine. An economics professor at Texas Tech said he had never failed a single student. But one semester he failed an entire class. You see, the students in that class insisted that socialism worked. Since no one would be poor and no one would be rich, it would then become the great equalizer. The economics professor said, okay, let's have an experiment in this class on socialism. And apparently the children all agreed. He said all grades will be averaged out and everybody will receive the same grade. Seemed like a great idea until they took a test. And after the first test, the grades were averaged and everybody got a B. The students who had studied hard were upset, while the students who had studied very little were happy. But as the second test rolled around, the students who had studied little studied even less. And the ones who had studied hard decided, if I can't make an A, what's the point? The second test average was a D, like in dog, and no one was happy. When the third test rolled around, the average grade was an F. They all failed. 3 tests, 1 semester. Quick. The scores never increased as bickering, blame, name-calling all resulted in hard feelings, and no one would study for or with anyone else. And to their great surprise, they all failed the course, or that semester. The professor told them that socialism would ultimately fail because the harder people try to succeed, the greater their reward. It's called capitalism. But when a government takes all the reward out of the system, nobody will try. And ultimately, no one will succeed. That's called socialism. And here's why it matters. One of our chief problems is that the word socialism does not carry the same stigma it did in the past, now that it has been resurrected by celebrity politicians like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And the younger Americans are being swayed by the images, the rhetoric, not to mention their teachers in school for 13, 15, 18 years. Our children are no longer being influenced by logic or rational thinking. Case in point. A recent study indicates that young people's political views tend to change as they grow older. But their support for socialistic policies is a sign that the old rules of politics are changing fast. We have classes now, grades, categories for people. We talk about the Gen Xers. The Gen Xers were born and lived, or were born during the decade 1966 to 1976. The top issues in their life seem to be access to health care, terrorism, national security, national debt. Same top issues for the baby boomers, their parents. The millennials are dated between 1977 and 1994. Generation Z is between 1995 and 2012. These two break the mold. They are projected to make up 37% of the electorate in 2020, and what they're looking for in a presidential candidate is shifting. Millennials' top issues are access to health care, global warming, climate change, mass shootings. The top 3 voting issues for Generation Z, according to the Harris poll, are mass shootings, racial equality, immigration policy, and treatment of immigrants. It's interesting to note that the farther young people get from traditional American values, the more likely they are to be concerned with the more emotional, social issues, issues they clearly do not understand. It tends to point toward mass indoctrination rather than personal experience. I mean, who is for mass shootings? Who is for racial inequality? Who's for ending immigration? No one. Idealistic young people are easily swayed by images of outrageous events. Not old enough, not experienced enough to understand the issues, they're moved by the rhetoric and by the images. And then when logic is applied, it must be that you just don't understand. Speaking of the thousands of Central Americans and Mexicans rushing our southern border, we hear, "Those babies are hungry, and you want them to die." No, their parents want them to die, else they would take better care of them. Poor planning on your part does not necessarily constitute an emergency on my part. But young people are now growing up in a social moral isolation. Their natural idealism is not being offset by reality, by rational parenting. It's not even being offset by religion anymore. And more Americans are being influenced by the media. It's in the television, the movies, the internet, the texts, the emotionalisms. And some of the more outrageous values and ideals are seeming more and more acceptable, more and more normal. Why? Because these young people have no immutable moral nor intellectual base, foundation. Everything they believe is in flux. And what they believe is what they're being spoon-fed by people who are out to control them. So where does that take us? We'll talk about that a little bit later in the show. But I can tell you, it does not take us up and out. It takes us the other way.